Recently, I played through the entire Twisted Metal series front to back. Some games were good, some were not so good. The curse of fours continues, it must be said. But after having played through the entire series and having seen its various iterations and interpretations, one question that's crossed my mind on multiple occasions is, what does the timeline of Twisted Metal look like? Because given all the craziness that happens, it can't be straightforward, and what do you know, it wasn't. Well, today I'm gonna do my best as an admitted newcomer to this series to try and piece together this series timeline. I look forward to seeing how much I screw this one up. Let's get started. Thankfully, we start out with an easy one. This is the tentpole from which the rest of the series jumps off from, and from this game we know a few major facts. First off, it takes place on Christmas Eve 2005. It's the 10th annual Twisted Metal tournament, so the first one was in 1996, the year after this game came out. I wonder what they were trying to say with that. Then the 2004 winner of Twisted Metal was a demon from hell named Minion. I've also heard he won the 2003 tournament, though I've never found evidence to confirm this. The first game is an anomaly in that while it establishes many of the elements the series would use going forward, it also has some elements about it that are very unique to this one game as far as the larger world of the series. For example, there's a character named Roadkill in this game, but it's a completely different Roadkill to the rest of the series as it has a different driver. You get a sense that they didn't quite know where they were going with the series just yet, but the major elements are there. Sweet Tooth, Outlaw, Calypso, and the father of Sweet Tooth, Charlie Kane. It sits resoundingly in 2005 on the timeline. The reason Outlaw is an important fixture in this series is that much like Liu Kang being the canonical winner of the first Mortal Kombat game, the driver of Outlaw, Sergeant Carl Roberts, is the canonical winner of the first game's tournament, as he's sent to space by Calypso. Then the sequel has his sister, Captain Jamie Roberts, trying to rescue him. It's the lone bit of continuity that solidifies him as the winner, which brings us to... This is certainly the game where they started to have a more firm grasp on what they wanted the series to be. With that, this game takes place a year later on Christmas Eve 2006 as established in the opening cutscene, and LA is still burning? The hell? The whole thing about this game taking place on Christmas Eve requires a bit of suspension of disbelief because we're going worldwide in this game, meaning our globe-trotting adventure is taking place over one night apparently. But still, that's when this game takes place. Sometime between the events of the first and second game, Charlie Kane digivolved from Yellow Jacket into Dark Tooth, the final boss here. Apparently he found out that his missing son is Sweet Tooth and has started getting really narky towards people who harm his son. Any other significant events? Well, as I mentioned before, some returning vehicles have new drivers. Roadkill is no longer being driven by Captain Spears, first name Sean, it's now being driven by Sweet Tooth's brother, Marcus Kane. It wasn't clear if he was supposed to be Sweet Tooth's alternate personality yet, though very possible. Then Spectre is now being driven by Ken Masters. Yes, I know, probably a coincidence. Then Hammerhead is now being driven by Mike and Stu, not Mike and Dave. So presumably Mike got rid of Dave at some point, unless it's not the same Mike. But then why'd they still call one of the drivers Mike? Anyway, Twisted Metal 2 is when the series is still easy to place as far as the timeline. Christmas Eve 2006. As for the winner this time, much like last time, the canonical winner of the 2006 Twisted Metal tournament is Outlaw 2, aka Jamie Roberts, who finds her brother floating in space, and knowing that Calypso was gonna rig her wish like that, preemptively jerry-rigged her police cruiser with space shuttle components so that she could rescue her brother and get back to Earth to return for the 2007 Twisted Metal tournament to finally take revenge on Calypso, which takes us to... Now, this is where things get a little bit canonically iffy. It doesn't immediately come across like that, but everything in the later parts of the series throws the canonical status of Twisted Metal 3 into question. Seeing as the development was handed over to a new studio, they didn't have the same care and precision in connecting the games canonically or tonally, so this one's a weird one. Still, as of right now, this game takes place 1 year after the last Twisted Metal tournament on Christmas Eve 2007. Now, when you complete the campaigns of some of the returning characters, Calypso implies that they won last time, however, it's canonically impossible for anyone but Outlaw 2 to have won last time, because this time Outlaw 3 consists of both Carl, now referred to as Buzz, and Jamie Roberts. She had to have rescued her brother, so she had to have won last time. And seeing as Calypso speaking to other characters as if they won last time, it muddies the water quite a bit. But there is a possible explanation for that, which comes up later. Once again, some of the returning cars have different drivers, like Hammerhead now being driven by Granny Dread. Hey, that rhymed. Spectre also has a new driver, this time Lance Wilder, formerly Dash. Once again, it's hard to know if these are the same vehicles with different drivers, or if they're new cars altogether that are just using the same name as cars of previous contestants who were defeated. It's hard to know what they were going for. Either way, this game takes place resoundingly on Christmas Eve 2007. However, it's moved into a slightly divergent path compared to the games before. This will make sense later. Unfortunately, some interesting events take place during the time period that Twisted Metal 4 takes place. At some point during 2008, it's impossible to know exactly when, Sweet Tooth and his merry band of clowns staged a coup to take over the Twisted Metal tournament by taking Calypso's ring that gives him power. As a result, the tournament is now being ran by Sweet Tooth. It's hard to know exactly when the tournament takes place in the year because Christmas Eve was Calypso's thing, but we can only assume that it's the same with Sweet Tooth because we have nothing else to go by. So why is it that I say it's unfortunate that this game has good ideas? Well, because this game is firmly non-canon. Why? Because of the very first frame of the opening cutscene, which severs the possible canonical connection to the previous games.
Stories tell of a carnival that would travel from town to town. At its head was a man surrounded by mystery, who was known only as Calypso.
You see, it's established here that the tournament has been going on since the dawn of automobiles, when it was clearly established in the first game that the tournament had only been going on since 1996. Retcons or retroactive continuity is a bad word to some, but retcons are fine as long as you're not directly contradicting something that's firmly established. Otherwise, retroactive continuity can very easily become retroactive contradiction. And the problem here is that there's no wiggle room. There are two clearly established plot points in two games in the same series that can't coexist with each other. The question may come up, which one is the one to prioritize? In situations like this, you have to go with what came before. If the fourth game has a retcon so blatant that it messes up the canon, the options are either you take the original game's word for it, in this case the first game, which means the fourth game is non-canon, or you take the fourth game's word for it, making the first game non-canon, by proxy making everything that came after it non-canon. Therefore, the series would cease to have a canon, including the fourth game, giving it sort of a catch-22 vibe. It's confusing, but the summary is, in cases like this, either the latter game is non-canon or the entire series gets retconned, meaning that regardless of what happens after the opening cutscene, Twisted Metal 4 simply can't take place within the grander series. Given all the weird stuff that goes on in this game too, like the level in somebody's bedroom, this game's clearly at best a fever dream. The previous games at least tried for some level of tonal and thematic consistency, but this game, yeah, not so much. That said, I think there's more to it than simply saying it's non-canon, and I'll cover that when it comes up. Next. Not only does this game look at a glance like it's from a completely different canon from the other games, but it also looks to be from a completely different planet. I can safely classify this game not as non-canon, but a game in its own canon. The difference being that 4 tried and failed to connect itself to the previous games, where this doesn't even bother. It's its own thing, and that's okay, firmly putting Small Brawl in its own category on the table. As to when it takes place, I might be wrong, but this game has so little story that I don't think you can accurately gauge when it takes place, or really anything about it. Not that it matters. Next. It would be very easy for me to just say this game is in its own canon and move on, but that's not the full story. As I discussed in a previous video, which you should totally check out, pluggo, this game is the world as Sweet Tooth sees it. So it could very well just be a standard tournament as Sweet Tooth sees it. When does this game take place though? Well, it was pointed out to me that the newspaper announcing Sweet Tooth's capture was dated for mid-October of 2001. Now here's the issue I run into. He said that he spent 3 months in the nut house. However, when he was caught, he was tried and convicted of murder, subsequently being put to death. If I know anything about murder trials, especially ones that concern the death penalty, they can take a very long time even if it's a sure thing, due to the amount of admin and paperwork that goes into sentencing someone to death. And given the fact that the newspaper was dated for mid-October, meaning he was caught roughly 2 to 2.5 months before the 2001 Twisted Metal tournament on Christmas Eve, although some allowances can be made for the possibility of it taking time before the journalists of this world could get the scoop, they would need to go to trial and convict him, and wait until the execution date went awry, as shown here, before locking him in the nut house for the 3 months it took before Calypso found him and entered him into the tournament on Christmas Eve, which as established is the anchor point for the entire series. Basically, the 2 to 2.5 month gap between getting caught and the 2001 Twisted Metal tournament makes me think that it would be impossible for this game to take place in 2001. The gap would need to be at least 3 months, but realistically much longer. So this is what I believe the timeline of events is, and take it for what you will, it is just speculation. I believe he was caught in early to mid-October of 2001, and the subsequent trials and process of execution took up the rest of 2001 and the majority of 2002. Then he was given a stay of execution when they couldn't kill him, so they threw him in the nut house in mid-August to mid-September of 2002 just as something to do with him while they figured out something else. So he was locked up in the nut house for 3 months, which, as he puts it, is the longest he'd been locked up in one place until Christmas time of 2002 comes around and Calypso frees him and invites him into his tournament, which still puts this game before Minions win in 2004. Now, with this game taking place in 2002, that does open up a can of worms which might place it in the non-canon or different canon category. Charlie Kane, Sweet Tooth's father, is dead. As is well established, the Yellow Jacket is being driven by Sweet Tooth's unnamed younger brother, and if this game takes place in 2002 before the events of the first game, that can't be the case because in that game, Charlie Kane was very much alive. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Yeah, I wouldn't put too much stock in that. It's well established that this game is an elaborate hallucination by Sweet Tooth, as I went into in this video. Once again, pluggo. And with an unreliable narrator like this, you can never be sure what's real and what's being twisted. Fittingly. As we know, this game could be taking place in Sweet Tooth's mind while he's in the clink, or it could be a sinister twisting of reality as he sees it, like putting a sinister Sweet Tooth-based color grading all over this game's imagery, and part of this might be interpreting his own father as being dead and being driven around by a brother that doesn't exist. That might make sense if Sweet Tooth has some problems he hasn't worked through in a my father is dead to me sort of way. With that, there are plenty of other elements from the official timeline that fits into this game as well, like Marcus Kane being Sweet Tooth's other personality. So as long as you're willing to apply the proper mental gymnastics, this game could be considered a prequel to the first game, but taken as a whole, it's dubiously canon at best. We know it happens in some form or fashion, but whether or not it's connected to the main series is dubious. Also making any story thread in this game dubious as well, because we don't know if it's happening as we're being told, if it's happening in a similar way but is being twisted by Sweet Tooth's imagination, or if this entire game is just one big fat hallucination. Black also had an unreleased sequel called Twisted Metal Lost, the beta of which is included in the PS2 port of Head On. Now, I was under the assumption that this game would take place a year later in 2003, but after having played the beta, in Junkyard Dog's intro dialogue, it states that at the end of Twisted Metal Black, he made a vow to outdo Sweet Tooth, and that was 10 years ago, meaning that if all my calculations are correct as to where Twisted Metal Black takes place on the timeline, that would place Twisted Metal Lost in 2012. It's still very possible that Black could be a prequel and this game could be a very distant sequel that both take place within Sweet Tooth's twisted perspective on the world. The 10-year thing would make sense as well because Charlie Kane is decomposing like hell. Either way, there's nothing about this game in its current state that would indicate it being canon or non-canon, so I'm just going to assume that it is. The fact that it's a sequel to Black would place it as equally dubiously canon, but until I get confirmation either way, I'll just place it in 2012. Man, I never get tired of talking about Twisted Metal Black. This game is so infinitely fascinating. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so I said earlier that Twisted Metal 3's timeline placement is slightly questionable, and this game is why. Now, Head On was developed by Incognito Inc., and ported to the PS2 by Eat Sleep Play But Never Mind, the same company that made Black and Small Brawl. Incognito Inc. is a development team comprised of the same people that made Twisted Metal 1 and 2, whereas, as we know, Twisted Metal 3 and 4 were handed over to 989 Studios. Essentially, Twisted Metal Head On is Twisted Metal 3 as the original developers originally intended it. This could mean one of a few things. Either Head On replaces Twisted Metal 3 in the timeline, it's an alternate version of Twisted Metal 3, the timeline splitting due to some unknown event, or Twisted Metal 3, because it was so divergent from the first two games, might have been the third game after an alternate version of the series with a Twisted Metal 1 and 2 that we didn't see or play. One where similar events to what we saw in our versions of those games happened, but still noticeably different enough to not be the same. Kinda like how this clip explains it.
That's the secret of the universe, you know. Billions of people making billions of choices, creating infinite Earths. Some so similar to each other you could spend a lifetime searching for any distinction. Others so radically different, they defy comprehension.
I'm leaning towards option C, frankly, because it creates a situation where nothing needs to be declared strictly speaking non-canon. Some of the games just end up in an alternate universe. This could also make Twisted Metal 4 canon in its own right. Because while it had retcons that made it impossible to be in line with the first two games, the fact that there's a game that actively replaces the game that preceded it, that could mean that in this alternate timeline that the tournament was started decades before it was in the versions of Twisted Metal 1 and 2 that we played. It would even explain how Calypso could speak to multiple people as if some of them had won the previous year, even though canonically speaking, Jamie Roberts was the only possible winner in Twisted Metal 2, because this hypothetical game that takes place before Twisted Metal 3 doesn't actually exist. So it doesn't have any firmly established canon, so they can create a string of possible outcomes without having to commit to anything. We didn't see it, so anything could have happened, so that settles it. As far as my interpretation, Twisted Metal Head-On takes place as the third game in the series, and Twisted Metal 3 and 4 are in an alternate timeline, with those versions of Twisted Metal 1 and 2 in that timeline being unseen. Of course, Calypso looking completely different in Head-On was a wrench being thrown into things, but I'll give them artistic license for that. They wanted to redesign a character, they're free to do so. I mean, how many redesigns has Sweet Tooth gone through? Lots. That's how many. One of the most noteworthy things that this game does is it takes the element wherein Marcus and Needles are split personalities of the same person and runs with it. Marcus's intro text even flat out mentions it, so unlike Black, there's no subtlety this time. The return of Darktooth, the final boss of 2, makes for some interesting discussion. Because when you unlock Darktooth this time around, it's established that the driver is the amalgam of the split personalities of Needles and Marcus working together. So when you fight him as the final boss, it might be Charlie Kane like last time, or Charlie Kane might have been killed in the final boss of the previous game, and now the mantle of Darktooth has been taken up by his son. You may ask what's going on when Marcus and Needles are fighting Darktooth if that's the case, but considering Black played around with perception of reality and hallucinations so heavily, I'm willing to bet that if either of them are fighting Darktooth, it's not actually really happening. Much like Sweet Tooth fighting Minion in Black, it's just an elaborate hallucination. The funny thing about this game is, several characters' intros play off as though their specific endings from the previous game are the canon ending, just like Twisted Metal 3. And this game doesn't even have the excuse that we didn't see the game that preceded it like Twisted Metal 3 does. I was gonna start this off by saying Outlaw 2's ending was the canon ending from TW2 going into this game because Jamie and Carl Roberts are once again working together in this game, but it's more complicated than that because there are other characters whose story arcs continue on from 2. For example, Mr. Slam's story plays off his ending in Twisted Metal 2 where he fell to his death and now he's coming back as a vengeful spirit. Or how about Axel, who is continuing his story arc in where he ripped off his own arms to escape the contraption he was in, and now he's been given robot arms. So while there's reason to believe that Outlaw 2's ending is definitely canon to a point, it seems that the canon ending of Twisted Metal 2 changes depending on which character you choose, and that only makes things more complicated. It means that the canon coming into and going out of Twisted Metal Head-On is more nebulous than it's ever been, and not for any other reason than they couldn't nail down exactly the story they wanted to go with. Damn. And considering that was the final game in the original canon, that leaves things on a bit of a mysterious note, like traveling to the edge of a cliff and looking beyond and all you see is darkness. Now, Twisted Metal 2012 for all intents and purposes is a reboot. It has a lot of similar elements at play from previous games, but it doesn't follow on from any specific continuity from the previous games and presents itself as a fresh start. Also, it makes a few retcons. For example, Charlie Kane is no longer the father of Needles / Marcus / Sweet Tooth, he's now the son of Same. So this game can occupy its own place in its own personal timeline. In this iteration, Calypso is a business mogul who basically runs the world and uses various levels of propaganda to keep the Twisted Metal tournament secret to all but the most valued of potential contestants, and the people who try to fight against him or protest have their souls trapped in a painting. I was originally going to say that there's no clear indication on when this game takes place, but then I remembered. Of course, Sophie Kane's gravestone. In the final cutscene for Sweet Tooth, Calypso says that Sophie committed suicide 10 years prior, and at the end of the game you get a close-up of her gravestone and it says 1996 to 2012. Hey, she's as old as me. So doing a bit of obvious calculation, it means that this game takes place in 2022. I rewatched the cutscenes to see if I could derive the timeline placement of any other notable events, but he never mentioned a specific amount of time since he'd killed his family, Mr. Grimm never mentioned a specific point in time when his dad died, and Dollface never mentioned a specific point in time when her injury took place. So I was able to find the year this game took place, but not much else. So it's kind of an anticlimactic finish to what was otherwise a fairly interesting series to examine the timeline of. That is until I made a discovery. The thing is, even though this game is a reboot, it might actually connect the entire Twisted Metal multiverse into one central point. In the epilogue to Twisted Metal 2012, Calypso has tokens from a bunch of former contestants, most notably things like 8-Ball's boxing glove, and you see that glass with the red liquid in it? I'm pretty sure that's the potion that Charlie Kane drank in his lost ending from Twisted Metal 1, and that's also the black box that both Crimson Fury and Warthog were fighting to obtain in the very first Twisted Metal, which were both lost endings as well as endings that made it into the finished game. Wait a minute. Are those the Blades of Chaos? Was Kratos a former winner of Twisted Metal? He doesn't seem like the driving type to me. Now, I'm not super sure what too many of these items are, and I'm sure they were just intended as Easter eggs, but the fact that they're actively using items from multiple other timelines spells something out for me. So I'm gonna throw out a wild theory here. I believe Calypso is a multi-dimensional being that connects the entire franchise together. That's why he has trinkets from other timelines, because each of these endings have, in a sense, taken place in their own timeline, which would also explain the slightly nebulous canon events of Twisted Metal Head-On and 3. Basically meaning that it's entirely possible that every single ending in the series is canon to one of the dimensions that Calypso occupies, and the canon series of events that we see that connect each game only connects the games in that one specific timeline, but there are hundreds, if not thousands of splintering timelines, each of which have one consistent factor: Calypso. The same exact version of Calypso who occupies each and every dimension and uses this multi-dimensional tournament to trap the souls of the dead, which are his power source. This could also explain things like Marcus Kane's ending in Twisted Metal 2. Marcus isn't actually waking up when he makes the wish to Calypso, Calypso is just transferring his consciousness from one possible plane of reality to another. This could even explain Calypso's different appearances. It's entirely possible that each reality he exists in sees him as different in his appearance. This blows my mind on so many levels and puts the entire series in a new light for me. Because now Twisted Metal is not just a singular thing, it's functionally infinite. I'm sure when they were making the first game back in 94 and 95 that none of this had occurred to them, but here we are. That's seriously cool. It seems that they've established a multiverse where everything that happens is, in its own way, canon to the overall series narrative arc, but they pick and choose which ones to continue off of from game to game. We don't always get to see where the splintering timelines end up, but they all happen. An infinity of timelines with one Calypso that occupies every single one of them, and it's all established by background details in a game made nearly 20 years after the very first game in its series. It's a shame we never got to see a continuation of Twisted Metal 2012 because, unlike other revivals of long-dormant PlayStation franchises in the early 2010s, Twisted Metal 2012 actually had a lot of potential ground to cover, especially with that Charlie Kane ending. A shame to be sure, but what are you gonna do? Maybe the TV show will be the shot in the arm the series needs. Either way, this is what the timeline ended up looking like, but even this doesn't do justice to just how twisted and complicated the timeline became by the end. I don't think I could accurately make a chart to describe the timeline of the series by the time Twisted Metal 2012 rolled around, but honestly, I think the series is more interesting for having this be where the series ended up. It's unorthodox, it's fascinating, and I could spend years dissecting all the individual elements that make Twisted Metal what it is. Now, before we go, I have one more thing to mention. I was trying to keep the contents of this video game specific, as in anything external to these games I wasn't going to mention. However, I would be remiss not to mention that while I was doing my research for this video, I stumbled across Calypso's backstory via the Twisted Metal wiki. It's not really relevant to the video, but it fleshes out Calypso's backstory slightly and is worth a read if you have a few minutes to read it or the 16-page Twisted Metal 2 comic book. I've been the King of Snark Style and or the Monarch of Snark on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me what you think. Maybe then I'll be able to remove this horrible mask from my face. And that's not a metaphor. Until next time, peace.